Most people think great powers shape history simply by acting. History suggests they shape it by how well they adapt when others change the strategic environment. Every major crisis is a test not only of military capability, but of assumptions, alliances, and long-term strategy. The question is never just who acted first, but who learns faster. If you want to understand where the Middle East and perhaps the international system is heading next, don't just follow the headlines. Learn how strategists interpret the decisions that everyone else overlooks. Let me start today by giving you a number, and I want you to hold on to it, because everything I'm about to explain over the next 20-some minutes is going to circle back to this single figure. The number is 9. 9 vessels attacked in the Strait of Hormuz since July 6th. 9 incidents in roughly 2 weeks inside the most heavily watched, most heavily patrolled, most strategically important stretch of water on the surface of this planet. And here's the part that should stop you cold. There is a ceasefire in place. There has been a signed ceasefire between the United States and Iran since June of 2026. And under that ceasefire, this is not supposed to be possible. So, the first question, the obvious question. The question every mainstream outlet is asking is simple. Why does Iran keep breaking the deal? But that is the wrong question. And by the end of this video, I think you are going to understand why the right question is far more uncomfortable for Washington. The right question is this. If Iran can violate a ceasefire 9 separate times in the exact place where America has concentrated the most firepower it has anywhere on earth, and America still cannot stop it or punish it in a way that changes anything, then what exactly is that ceasefire worth? And more importantly, who does that arrangement actually serve? Welcome back to John Global Explainer. If you care about understanding the machinery underneath the headlines rather than the headlines themselves, you are in the right place. And I would ask you to stay until the end, because the last point I make today is the one that reframes all the others. Now, before we look at what happened this week, I need to teach you one concept, because when this concept clicks into place, the 9 attacks stop looking like chaos and start looking like exactly what they are, which is design. The concept is what I call the asymmetry of the tripwire. Let me explain it with something ordinary. Imagine you own the biggest, most expensive house on the street. Alarm system, cameras on every corner, a private security guard patrolling the fence. You have spent more on protecting that house than everyone else on the block combined. And your neighbor, a much poorer man with no security at all, keeps quietly opening your back gate at night. He does not steal anything. He does not break a window. He just opens the gate, stands there for a moment, and walks away. Now, what do? If you shoot him, you are the monster who killed an unarmed neighbor over an open gate, and the whole street turns against you. If you do nothing, everyone on the street learns that your alarm system, your cameras, your expensive guard, all of it means nothing. He can open your gate whenever he wants. Either way, you lose. That is the asymmetry of the tripwire. The weaker actor does not need to defeat the stronger one. He only needs to keep triggering the tripwire in a way that forces the stronger one to choose between looking cruel or looking helpless. There is no third option. And I want you to keep that dilemma in your mind. Because the Strait of Hormuz right now is that back gate. And America is the man standing in the doorway with the expensive alarm system, unable to figure out what to do. Okay? Let's look at the actual sequence. because the timeline here matters more than any single event inside it. In June of 2026, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding, a ceasefire. On paper, hostilities were supposed to wind down. Now keep in mind, this came after months of American escalation, after billions spent, after strikes that were supposed to bring Tehran to its knees. The ceasefire was sold to the American public as a kind of victory, a stabilization, a return to control. That framing lasted a matter of weeks. Because starting July 6, ships began getting hit in Hormuz. And not randomly. Iran began forcing commercial vessels to pass through its own territorial waters. Think about what that phrase actually means. Forcing ships through Iranian territorial waters. That is not a pirate raid. That is a state asserting sovereign control over the movement of global trade through a choke point it happens to sit on top of. By July 18th, the count was 9 ships since the 6th. 9. And Iran is doing this while a ceasefire is technically still in effect, while the June memorandum is, on paper, still the governing document. Britannic's live tracking, as recently as today, describes exactly this. Repeated attacks on shipping in Hormuz despite the June memorandum still being in force. So, the ceasefire exists and does not exist at the same time. It exists on paper. It has evaporated on the water. And that gap, that space between what the document says and what is physically happening is the entire story. Now, here is where most coverage goes wrong. And I want to be precise about it. The Western framing treats each of these 9 attacks as a violation, a breach, a broken promise, as if Iran signed something and then dishonestly reneged. And on the most literal level, sure, that is technically true. But that framing assumes the ceasefire was ever meant to be a genuine peace. And I would argue to you that from Tehran's strategic perspective, the ceasefire was never peace. It was terrain. It was a piece of ground to be occupied and exploited. Let me explain the difference because this is crucial. When a strong power signs a ceasefire, it usually wants the fighting to actually stop because it already holds what it wants and it wants to lock in the status quo. When a weaker power that believes time is on its side signs a ceasefire, it may want something entirely different. It may want a pause in the heavy bombing while retaining the ability to keep applying pressure at a level too low to justify a full American response. The ceasefire, in other words, becomes a shield. It caps the intensity of what America can do without looking like a treaty violator itself, while leaving Iran free to keep pressing that back gate open, one ship at a time. And this is exactly what the asymmetry of the tripwire predicts. Each attack is calibrated. None of them is a Pearl Harbor. None of them is the kind of spectacular mass casualty event that would give a president the political cover to unleash everything. They're just big enough to disrupt global shipping, spike insurance rates, and remind the world who controls the water. And just small enough that any overwhelming American response looks disproportionate. Let me give you the second piece. And this is the one almost nobody's connecting. On July 15th, the United States launched a fresh round of military strikes on Iran, framed explicitly as protecting ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Read that again. The strikes were justified as protecting shipping, and yet by July 18th, the tally of attacked vessels since July 6th had reached 9, and Iran was still forcing ships through its waters. So, the American strikes did not restore freedom of navigation. They did not stop the attacks. They did not reopen the strait to normal unmolested traffic. What they did was demonstrate in real time in front of the entire world that even direct kinetic American military action was not translating into the one outcome that would actually matter, which is safe passage. And this is the tripwire dilemma made flesh. America chose to act, to hit back, to not look helpless. And the ships kept getting attacked anyway, which means America managed to look aggressive and ineffective simultaneously. That is the worst of both worlds. That is the outcome the asymmetry of the tripwire pushes a superpower toward when it is facing an opponent who understands that control matters more than raw power. Now, I want to pause and address the thing you might be thinking. You might be thinking, Professor, this is just Iran being reckless. This is escalation. This is a poor country lashing out. And I understand why it looks that way. But recklessness and strategy can produce the exact same behavior on the surface. The way you tell them apart is by asking whether the behavior is consistent, calibrated, and pointed at a coherent objective. And it is. Look at what Iran attached to all of this on the diplomatic side. According to the House of Commons Library, Iran has set a precondition before it will even discuss its nuclear program. That precondition is a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Now, sit with the sophistication of that move for a second. Iran is saying, you want to talk about the thing you care about most, my nuclear program? Fine. But first, you have to deliver something on a completely different front. A front involving your closest regional ally. That is not the behavior of a state flailing in panic. That is the behavior of a state that believes it is holding leverage and is methodically pricing that leverage. Iran is linking the maritime pressure in Hormuz, the nuclear question, and the Israel-Hezbollah conflict into a single bundle negotiation where it, not Washington, sets the sequence. The ship attacks are the pressure. The nuclear talks are the prize America wants. The Israel-Hezbollah precondition is the price. Every piece is connected, and that connection is invisible if you only watch the explosions. Let me now bring in the framework that ties the whole thing together, because this is where we move from tactics to the actual shape of the world. There is a body of thought in international relations about what happens to a dominant power when its ability to enforce order starts to erode faster than its willingness to admit it. The scholars who develop hegemonic stability theory, thinkers like Kindleberger and Gilpin, argue that a hegemon, a dominant power, provides certain global public goods. And one of the oldest, most fundamental of those goods is freedom of the seas, open sea lanes, safe passage for commerce. For most of the last century, the promise of the American-led order was essentially this. If you are a trading nation, your goods can move across the ocean safely because the United States Navy guarantees it. That guarantee is not a small thing. It is arguably the load-bearing wall of the entire economic order that America built and led. Now, watch what 9 attack ships in the world's most important strait actually does to that promise. It does not just embarrass a president. It puts a crack in the load-bearing wall because every shipping company, every insurer, every energy trader, every finance ministry on earth is now recalculating a number they had treated as fixed for decades, which is the assumed reliability of American maritime protection. And CSIS, one of the most established national security think tanks in Washington, has been openly analyzing exactly this, the uncertainty hanging over Hormuz and over global energy markets, even after the ceasefire. When your own premier strategic institutions are writing about uncertainty rather than restored order, that tells you the guarantee has already been damaged in the eyes of the people who matter, the people who move money and cargo. And now we arrive at the point I promised you at the beginning. the one that reframes everything else. Because if you have been paying attention, a question should be forming in your mind. If America is spending, bleeding, striking, and still cannot stop 9 ships from being attacked, and if the credibility of its maritime guarantee is cracking in the process, then who is gaining from all of this? And the answer is not Iran. Not primarily. Iran is gaining tactically, locally, in its own neighborhood. But the real strategic winner is sitting thousands of miles away and has not fired a single shot. I am talking about China, and I am not speculating here. This is now being said out loud in the most mainstream possible venues. The Washington Post ran an opinion piece on July 17th with a thesis right there in the framing that the Iran war is handing an enormous strategic advantage to China. On the same day, Foreign Policy published a piece arguing that China is winning without firing a single bullet, that this entire crisis is strengthening Beijing's global position. When the Washington Post and Foreign Policy are independently reaching the same conclusion in the same week, that is not a fringe take anymore. That is the emerging consensus among serious analysts. So let me walk you through the mechanism, because the how is more important than the headline. China gains from this in at least 3 distinct ways. And I want you to see all 3 because they compound. First, energy. China is the largest buyer of the oil that flows through Hormuz. And it is also the primary destination for Iranian crude specifically. As the strait becomes chaotic and Iran becomes more isolated from Western markets, Iran becomes more dependent on the one large customer willing to keep buying, which is China. And China gets to buy at a discount from a supplier with fewer and fewer options. Chaos in Hormuz that terrifies European and American markets is, for Beijing, a buyer's market. Second, attention and resources. Every carrier group, every squadron, every $1 billion, every hour of senior policymaker attention that America pours into the Persian Gulf is a carrier group, a squadron, $1 billion, and an hour of attention that is not being directed toward the Pacific, toward the Taiwan Strait, toward the region China actually cares about most. America has a finite amount of the most precious strategic resource of all, which is focus. And this war is a black hole for American focus. Third, and this is a subtle one, credibility. China's central argument to the rest of the world, to the global south, to the fence-sitters, is that American security guarantees are unreliable and that the American-led order is decaying. China does not have to prove that argument with a speech. It just has to point at 9 attacked ships in the Strait of Hormuz under an active ceasefire and let the world draw its own conclusions. Every ship that gets hit while America watches is a free advertisement for Chinese thesis about the future of world order. So, now let's put the whole picture together, because individual pieces are striking, but the assembled machine is a real story. Iran signs a ceasefire it treats as terrain, not peace. It uses the shield of that ceasefire to keep applying calibrated pressure in Hormuz. 9 ships and counting, each attack too small to justify total war, but big enough to disrupt global trade. America, trapped by the asymmetry of the tripwire, responds with strikes that make it look aggressive without making it effective. Because the ships keep getting hit. The credibility of America's oldest promise, freedom of the seas, cracks in full view of every insurer and energy trader on Earth. And China, having fired nothing and spent nothing, harvests cheaper oil, a distracted rival, and a global audience newly skeptical of American guarantees. That is not 9 random acts of aggression. That is a coherent strategic environment in which the weakest visible actor and the strongest invisible actor are both gaining, and the ostensibly most powerful actor, the United States, is losing on every axis at once, while insisting it is winning. Now, I want to be fair and rigorous because that is a standard I hold on this channel. Let me steelman the American position because there is one. A defender of Washington's approach would say, look, restraint is itself a form of strength. America is not responding disproportionately precisely because it is disciplined, because it does not want to trigger a wider war or an oil shock that hurts its own economy. And that the ceasefire, even a leaky one, is better than the full-scale bombing campaign that preceded it. And honestly, there is something to that. A leaky ceasefire that keeps intensity capped may generally be preferable to open war. And a president who avoids the catastrophic escalation is doing something responsible. But here is the problem with that defense, and it is a deep one. It concedes the entire strategic point. Because if American restraint is real, then American deterrence is not. Deterrence works only if your opponent believes that crossing your line brings unacceptable consequences. If Iran can attack 9 ships, and Iran believes, correctly, that America will not or cannot impose unacceptable consequences, then the line is not a line. It is a suggestion. And once your adversaries and your allies both learn that your red lines are suggestions, you do not get that credibility back by writing a stern statement. You get it back only by paying an enormous price to reestablish it, or you do not get it back at all. That is the trap. Restraint that looks wise in the moment can be corrosive over time because it teaches everyone watching exactly how far they can push. And the whole world is watching Hormuz right now, taking notes. Here is a subtle point I do not want you to miss because it is the kind of thing that separates real analysis from headline chasing. The number 9 is going to keep climbing. It was 9 as of July 18. It will be more by the time some of you are watching this. And the mainstream coverage will treat each new incident as a fresh outrage, a new violation, a new headline. But strategically, the 10th ship, the 11th, the 12th, they do not represent new events. They represent the continuation of a demonstrated fact, which is that the tripwire keeps getting tripped and nothing decisive follows. And there is a threshold effect here that policymakers underestimate. The first violation is a crisis. The 9th violation is a pattern, and a pattern is far more damaging than any single crisis. Because a pattern is what markets, allies, and adversaries actually price in. A one-time attack can be dismissed as an aberration. 9 attacks in 2 weeks under an active ceasefire is a new normal. And the new normal is precisely that American protection of the world's most important waterway is no longer something anyone can take for granted. That shift from aberration to normal is the most consequential thing that has happened in this entire episode, and it is happening quietly, cumulatively, one ship at a time beneath a stream of headlines that keep treating each incident as if it were the first. So, let me leave you with a question I think actually matters. The one Washington is least equipped to answer. We keep asking why Iran broke the ceasefire 9 times. But the deeper question is why a ceasefire that could be broken 9 times without meaningful consequence was ever mistaken for a victory in the first place. Because the honest answer is that the June memorandum was never resolution. It was a pause that each side interpreted through its own strategy and Iran's interpretation. Ceasefire as terrain has so far proven more effective than America's interpretation. Ceasefire as stabilization. When the most powerful military in human history cannot guarantee safe passage through a strait it has surrounded, The problem is not a shortage of firepower. Firepower was never the missing ingredient. The missing ingredient is the asymmetry of a tripwire strips away from a dominant power the moment it faces a patient, calibrated adversary. That thing is control. And as I have argued before on this channel, and as I will keep arguing until it stops being true, control is worth more than dominance. America still has the dominance. 9 ships in Hormuz just proved for the 9th time who has the control. If this way of looking at the news underneath the headlines rather than on top of them is what you come here for, then do me a favor and subscribe to John Global Explainer. Because the next few weeks in the Gulf are going to generate a lot of noise. And I want to help you hear the signal inside it. Leave me a comment with the one number you think will matter most a month from now, the ship count, the oil price, or the day Iran finally names its price at the negotiating table. I read them, and the sharpest ones often shape the next lecture. And a necessary word before I go. Everything I have shared today is for educational and analytical purposes only. It is not political, financial, or military advice. My aim is to stay factual, to reason carefully, and to follow the logic wherever it leads, even when the conclusion is uncomfortable. Thank you for thinking through this with me. I will see you in the next one.